So at this point of the course, you're already pretty good at working with the DOM, but there are still a ton of things to learn. So to do that, in this section, we will build a beautiful website project with a lot of different components and visual effects that require some pretty advanced DOM manipulation techniques. So after this section, you will have all the tools that you need in order to implement any visual component or effect that you can imagine. Now, many of the things that I'm going to show you here could actually also be added to a web page simply by using a third-party library. But you want to master JavaScript and the DOM, right? And so therefore, you need to know how to do things yourself. And so, let's go learn advanced DOM manipulation now. So in this section, we're going to build yet another project. So let's start by taking a look at it. So over the last two sections, we built the application for a fictional bank called Bankist. Now in this section, we're going to be building the kind of marketing website for the same fictional bank. So again, that's Bankist here. And so let's take a look at it. Now, of course, all of this HTML and CSS that you see here is already provided for you in the starter files. But all the effects that you see here going on will be built by us throughout this section. So maybe you already saw this section here fading in and moving a little bit. And also notice here what happens with these images. So it's basically lazy loading these images as we scroll to them. So here you saw also this section fading in. Maybe you already also noticed that the menu bar has become sticky here at the top. And when we hover over each of these links, then all the other links get grayed out. You see? And so all of that is done using JavaScript. And also here you get this nice pop-up window. And so again, that's JavaScript. Here we have this component, which is a tabbed component, which is pretty common to see in modern user interfaces. And so you will learn how to do this as well. Then again, this section here sliding in. And here we have the coolest component of all of them, which is this slider. So as we click here, you see, basically we have these three slides with these three dots, and we are circling through them as we click these arrows or even these dots. So these dots, they work just the same as the arrows. And I'm sure you have seen a slider like this. And so now you will learn one way of building a really cool slider. Just like this one. And here again, we will have the pop-up window. And of course, if we click here, then we get a smooth scrolling animation to that part of the page. And the same here on this button. Okay, so you see there are a lot of dynamic effects going on here on this page. And so I hope you're really excited for this project because you will learn how to do all of them. And these are for sure some of the most important and commonly used effects that you will see on all websites. And so that's why I decided to include this project in the course so that you can learn how to do them yourself. I also tried to design a really nice and beautiful website which looks like a real marketing page of a real company. And so if you include this in your portfolio, then I'm sure it will look really cool on your portfolio too. So I hope you like this page, that you like the effects that we're going to implement, and that you're just as excited as I am to get started with this project. So anyway, please open up your starter files that I provided for this project. And so there you have this big HTML file that I will explain you as necessary. Then this huge style sheet with hundreds of lines of code that I wrote just for this project. And then of course the script.js. Now here I already included the code for the modal window because this is actually exactly the code that we wrote before in one of the projects. Remember that? So this is exactly the same. And so if we start our project, it should actually already be working. So let's open up here our console, live server. And so this is the page here. Now I'm seeing this page at, I think, 75%. Yeah, because otherwise it looks really ugly, right? And at this point also, nothing works yet as it did in the demo project because the JavaScript is simply not yet written. And so, of course, nothing works here. And everything looks a little bit weird. So let's go back to 75%. But what should already be working is this pop-up. So this modal window. And again, that is because it is exactly the same code that we already wrote before. Now there are just two small changes that I want to do here in this code very quick before we get started. The first one is watch what happens if we click this button here, like in this position. So you see that the page scrolled back to the top. And that is because, let me show you here. So that's because this is actually now a link and not a button. And on a link, when we have this hash here as the hyperlink, so as href, then that will make the page jump to the top. So that's the default behavior when we click a link that has this hyperlink here. And so if that is the default, we already know a way of preventing that default, right? Do you remember how? Well, all we need here is in this function, which is the one responsible for opening this model, is to get access to the event, and then on the event we call prevent default. So hopefully you remember that from earlier. So let's see again. And this time the page didn't jump. So we fixed that. And now the second part that I want to quickly fix is getting rid of this old school for loop that we have here. Because now we know of a better way of doing this, which is the for each loop. So we have this buttons open modal, which is a node list. And it's a node list because it's the result of query selector all. All right. Now remember that a node list is not an array, but still, it does have the for each method. So it doesn't have most of the methods that arrays have, but for each is one of the methods that a node list has as well. And so let's use that now. So buttons open modal dot for each. And so remember that we did this loop here in the first place because we wanted to add an event listener to each of the buttons. So in our case, that's this button here, and also this one down here. So this one. Well, for some reason it's not working right now. But let's first finish this. All right. So anyway, we want to attach an event listener to this button and to this one here at the same time. And so that's why we did this loop. But now we have a better way of doing it, which is by simply providing a callback function here to for each. So each one will be a button, and then on that button, we will simply add an event listener. And so that's simply this part. And so now this is exactly the same as this, but in a lot easier way. So let's give it a save. And that works. And let's check the other one as well. And yeah. So this one works as well. And so with this, our code is a little bit nicer and adapted to this page. All right. So we are ready to get started in this section. And we will do that right in the next video by learning a little bit more about how the DOM actually works behind the scenes. Let's start this section by learning how the DOM really works behind the scenes, and more specifically, how the DOM is organized internally. This will make it easier to understand everything else that's going to follow in this section. So first, remember that the DOM is basically the interface between our JavaScript code and the browser, or more specifically, HTML documents that are rendered in and by the browser. Now, we have written a ton of JavaScript code in this course so far, but many times completely without interacting with the browser. So without using the DOM, right? But now we're back to working with web pages, and therefore with the DOM. And this time we're gonna learn as much as possible about the DOM and how to create amazing dynamic effects. So let's remember what we already know about the DOM, which is that we can use it to make JavaScript interact with the browser. And again, more specifically, we can create and modify and delete elements, set styles and classes and attributes, and listen and respond to events. In practice, this works because a DOM tree is generated from any HTML document. And a DOM tree is a tree-like structure made out of nodes, which looks something like this. And we can then interact with this tree as we already did a couple of times in this course. Now, how does that interaction actually work? Well, the DOM is a very complex API, which, remember, stands for Application Programming Interface. So it's the interface that we can use to programmatically interact with the DOM. In practice, that means that the DOM contains a ton of methods and properties that we use to interact with the DOM tree, such as the query selector, add event listener, or create element methods, or also the inner HTML, text content, or children properties, and many, many more. Now, in the DOM, there are different types of nodes, just as I mentioned before. For example, some nodes are HTML elements, but others are just text, remember? And this is really important to understand because all these DOM methods and properties are organized into these different types of objects. And so let's now take a look at how the DOM API is organized behind the scenes. So first, every single node in the DOM tree is of the type node. And such as everything else in JavaScript, each node is represented in JavaScript by an object. This object gets access to special node methods and properties, such as text content, child nodes, parent node, clone node, and many others. Now, we already know that there are different types of nodes, right? So how should these be represented? Well, this node type has a couple of child types, so to say. And these are the element type, the text type, the comment type, and also the document type. So whenever there is text inside any element, we already know that it gets its own node, right? And that node will be of the type text. And the same actually happens for HTML comments. And that's because the rule is that everything that's in the HTML has to go into the DOM as well. Now, for the element itself, there is the element type of node. And this type of node gives each HTML element access to a ton of useful properties, such as inner HTML, class list, children, or parent element. There are also many useful methods, like append, remove, insert adjacent HTML, query selector, closest, and that's just to name a few. So again, each element will be represented internally as an object. Now, just to make this complete, the element type has internally an HTML element child type. And that element type itself has exactly one child type for each HTML element that exists in HTML. So we have a special type for buttons, a special type for images, for links, and so on and so forth. And that's important because each of these HTML elements can have different unique properties. For example, an image has a source attribute in HTML which no other element has. Or the anchor element for links has the href attribute which also no other element has. And so the DOM needs a way of storing these different attributes, and therefore different types of HTML elements were created in the DOM API. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, this diagram that I'm showing you here is of course not a DOM tree, right? So this is not a representation of any HTML document. This is just the way that different types of nodes are represented behind the scenes in the DOM API. All right? But anyway, now comes the really important part. Because what makes all of this work is something called inheritance. So what is inheritance? Well, inheritance means that all the child types will also get access to the methods and properties of all their parent node types. For example, an HTML element will get access to everything from the element type, like inner HTML or class list or all these other methods and properties. And besides that, it will also get access to everything from the node type, because that is also its parent type. Okay? So we can think of this as if the HTML button element, for example, is also an element and also a node. All right? Now, this may all seem a bit weird and confusing, but don't worry. We will learn why this kind of inheritance works very soon when we finally talk about object-oriented JavaScript. For now, what I want you to understand is that the DOM API is broken up into these different types of nodes. I also want you to understand that each of these types of nodes has access to different properties and methods, and that some of them even inherit more properties and methods from their ancestors in this organization. All right? Now, we didn't talk yet about the document node type. So, document, which we use all the time in DOM manipulation, is in fact just another type of node. So it contains important methods such as query selector, create element, and get element by ID. And note how query selector is available on both the document and the element types. So keep this in mind because it will be important later on. All right, and now there is just one final missing piece here, because the DOM API actually needs a way of allowing all the node types to listen to events. And remember, we usually listen for events by calling the addEventListener method on an element or the document, right? So why does that actually work? Well, it's because there is a special node type called eventTarget, which is a parent of both the node type and also the window node type. And so with this, thanks to inheritance, we can call addEventListener on every single type of node in the DOM API. Because all elements, as well as document and window, and even text and comment, will inherit this method. And therefore, we will be able to use addEventListener on all of them, just as if it was their own method. Now, just to be clear, we do never manually create an event target object. Okay? This is just an abstract type that we do not use in practice. This all really happens behind the scenes to make all the functionality work as we expect it to work. So, in a nutshell, this is how the DOM API works and is structured behind the scenes. There are still some simplifications here, but this is all that really matters. And I really wish that I could have had this diagram when I learned JavaScript for the first time, because I really think that this helps structuring all this information in your mind. Now, if you want to go even deeper than this, there is still tons of material that you can check out in the MDN documentation. And if you ask me, it's all really fascinating. But again, all that you need to know is really in this lecture. It took me a lot of hours to put this one together, but I think it was well worth it. And I hope you think the same. But anyway, let's now move on to the practical part of this section, where we will then finally use many of these things in action. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to select, create, and delete elements with JavaScript. Now, the goal of this lecture is more to be like a quick reference for you in the future, because these methods that I'm going to show you here are actually way more difficult to find and to understand from the MDN documentation. And so when you need some of these methods in the future, then all you have to do is to come back to this lecture and see how it works. And let's start by learning a little bit more about selecting elements. And I'm going to start at the very top of any HTML document. So as you know, that is the document. And so actually we do have a special way of selecting the entire document of any web page, so of any document. And that's document element. All right. So just document here is not enough to select the document element, because this is not the real DOM element. All right. So for example, if we want to apply CSS styles to the entire page, we always need to select document element. Okay. Let's just take a look here in the console. And so indeed, that is now the entire HTML here. Okay. And we can also easily select the head and body. So that's just head and dot body, as you can imagine. So this is not visible on the page, and the body is then also the entire kind of visible document. All right. So for these special elements, we don't even need to write any selector. But otherwise, as you already know, we can use query selector. So that's nothing new. For example, we can select the header element just like this, and this will then return the first element that matches this selector here. Now, if we want to select multiple elements, then we should use document.querySelectorAll. So again, we already used this one. And so here on this page, we have multiple elements with the section class. So basically each of these here are a section with the class of section. Okay. And I will actually store this here in a variable because I want to show you something a little bit later. Okay. But as you know already, this will return a node list, and then that will contain all of the elements that are a section, so that are selected by this selector. So these ones we have been using all the time, and in fact, they are the most used ways of selecting elements. Now, as you learned, hopefully from the previous lecture, these are available not only on the document here, like this, but also on all the elements, okay? And we actually use this a lot when we want to select child elements, as we will do a little bit later in this section, okay? Next, I think we also already talked about getElementById. And so here we only pass the ID name itself without the selector. So this section here has the ID section 1. And so, yeah, we don't need the selector here. That's only for the query selector methods. All right. So I showed you this one because now there are also some others. So there are getElements, and that's elements, so with an S, by tag name. And so let's say we want to get all the buttons. So all the elements with the name of button, basically. So let's actually store this also, all buttons, and then log it to the console. Let's give it some more space here. And so here now you see all the buttons that are on our page. Now, what I wanted to show you is that this method actually returns an HTML collection. So that's different from a node list, because an HTML collection is actually a so-called live collection. And that means that if the DOM changes, then this collection is also immediately updated automatically. So for example, if I remove this button here, and I can do that by clicking inspect, and then that will select that button here, then all I need to do is to hit delete. And then if I go back here to the console and try to read the all buttons again, then you see that we only have 8 elements in here, while before we had 9, right? So that's something very important to keep in mind when you use this selector here, okay? And sometimes it's actually quite helpful to have an HTML collection like this, which updates automatically. Because of course, we can also delete elements from the DOM programmatically, not just manually, like I just deleted this button here earlier. All right. Now the same does not happen with a node list. So if I take this whole section here and delete it, and if I then try to read all the sections, then I still have the same 4 elements here in the node list. And that's because this variable here was created by the time that this section still existed. And it didn't update itself as I deleted one of its elements. All right. So again, that's important to keep in mind. Okay. And finally, I also want to show you get elements by class name. So this is similar again to get element by ID and get elements by tag name. So here we can now specify a class name. So let's say button. And once again, we don't need a selector. So it's not a dot, it's simply the name of the classes. And this one will also return a live HTML collection. So just as I explained you earlier. Okay, so this is how we select elements. Selecting elements. Once of these you already knew. So basically these 2 more modern ones, but these ones also have a place. So this one and this one, in case that you really need an HTML collection, which in some situations is useful, but most of the time I simply keep using query selector and query selector all. Okay. Next up, let's talk about creating and inserting elements. Now, we can create HTML elements using the insert adjacent HTML function that we used before in the Bankist application. Remember? So we used insert adjacent HTML to create movements, right? And this is a quick and easy way of creating elements that I really like a lot and use the most, actually. So please go back to the Bankist application and remember exactly how it works. All right. So I don't need to talk about this one here again, and I will instead focus on some other ways of creating elements, because sometimes it's more useful to actually build the element a bit more from scratch, like more programmatically using a combination of some other methods. So let's see how, and then it will all make sense. Okay, so let's use document.createElement. Okay, and then here we need to pass in the string of basically the tag name. So I want to create a div here now. And so this will return a DOM element that we can then save somewhere. And I'm calling this one message, and I will explain why in a second. Okay. So again, this here creates a DOM element and then stores that element into the message. Now that element is not yet anywhere in our DOM. All this is a DOM object that we can now use to do something on it, but it is not yet in the DOM itself. So it's nowhere to be found on our web page here. Okay, if we want it on the page, then we need to manually insert it into the page. But first, let's actually do something with it. So for example, we can add classes. And so now this is like any other selection that we have. Okay, so if we have an element in our DOM and select it, for example, using query selector here, like this, then the result is also a DOM object that we can use in our code. And this here is now just the same. It's just an object that represents a DOM element. And so, just like before, we can use, for example, class list on it. So class list, and then we can add, and I will add a class called cookie message. And that's because here we will now programmatically build an element which will display a small cookie message on the bottom of the screen. So I'm sure you've seen these on all web pages these days. They are quite annoying. So let me search here for cookie, and here you go. So this is the class that I created for this cookie message. And so this is the one we are adding now to our newly created element. Okay, let's get rid of this here. And now we can keep going. So for example, we can add text into the element. And as always, we do that using text content. So let's just say we use cookies for improved functionality and analytics, something like that. Analytics. Okay, so this inserts simply text, but of course we can also insert HTML. And so that is then inner HTML, which we also already used before. And remember that we can use both of these properties to read and to set content. Okay, and so here, let's now write a string of HTML. So let's copy this, and then we can also like add a button. Okay, I'm missing the colon here. So let's add a button element. Okay, so I'm just writing some HTML here. This doesn't matter, just copy this code. All right, it's just so that it will have the correct formatting then based on the CSS that I wrote before. So this will basically just display a nicely formatted button saying, got it. Okay, but anyway, we now have this element, and all we have to do now is to insert it into our DOM. And let's do that here in our header. So give it some more space. So all of this here is our header element. So this takes up so much space. Can't get rid of it for some reason. So all of this is our header. And so we can now select this header and then append our message to that element. And we already have that here. Let's call this the header. And now we can say header.prepend. And now, indeed, here it is. So here is our message. So maybe you saw it being added here. So indeed, it's now also really in our DOM. Now, for some reason, I think this doesn't look quite right. Well, maybe it does. So what matters here is that we just inserted this element really into our HTML. So right into our DOM. So prepending basically adds the element as the first child of this element. Okay, but we can also add it as the last child. And so that is append. So header.append message. And what happens now? So now we see that it's really appended. So it's the last child. So it's got to be, yeah, it's here. Now, what we see here is that the element was actually only inserted once. Now, that's because this element here, so message, is now indeed a live element living in the DOM. And so therefore, it cannot be at multiple places at the same time. It's just like a person that also cannot be at two places simultaneously, right? So what happened here is that we first prepended the element, and then we appended it. And what this append did here was to basically move the element from being the first child to being the last child. All right. So basically it moved the element and didn't really insert it because it was already inserted here by prepend. So what this means is that we can use the prepend and append methods not only to insert elements, but also to move them. And again, that is because a DOM element is unique, so it can always only exist at one place at a time. But now, what if we actually wanted to insert multiple copies of the same element? Well, in that case, we actually would have to first copy the first element. So let's comment out this part here and say header.append. And then instead of appending the message directly, we first clone it. So that's clone node. And then we need to pass in true, or we can pass in true, which simply means that all the child elements will also be copied. And so now, as you see, we get the same cookie message in both places. But usually this is not what we want. So let's actually only append it. So having it here at the bottom where it makes the most sense. Now, to finish, there are actually two more methods, and that is before and after. And as the name says, this one will insert the message before the header element, so as a sibling, and this one here after the header element, so also as a sibling. Let's just get rid of this so we can see it here before. And so now it's actually really before the header. So first a cookie message and then the header, but they are siblings. And now the same here, it's now after the header. So we have the whole header and then we have this cookie element. All right. So that is how we create and insert elements programmatically. And now to finish, let's also delete elements. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to remove this element when we click this button. So let's select this button and then as we click it, remove the message. So document.querySelector, and we give it the class of button close cookie, right? And then add event listener. And now all we have to do is message.remove. And again, here we don't have to select the message element again because we already have it in memory. So we already have it stored in a variable. So there's no need to run a document.querySelector. Of course, we could do it, and it would work as well. So we could select the element with the class of cookie message. But again, that's not necessary because we already have it stored in memory. Okay, and so if I click this, then it's gone. All right, it's nowhere to be found now. Now, this remove method here is actually very recent. Before this method existed, all we could do was to remove child elements. And so back then, we had to select the parent element first and then remove the child from there. So that would look like this. So message, and then we would move up in the DOM tree, remove child. And then again, the name of the element that we want to remove. So this is a bit cumbersome, but again, this is how we used to do it. And I'm sure you will see this in some code bases because many people also don't yet know about this newer way of doing things. And by the way, this way of moving up and down in the DOM tree, like selecting the parent element, is called DOM traversing. And there is a whole lecture on that a bit later in this section. Let's just see if this works as well. And indeed, it does. So this is how we select, create, insert, and delete elements. And to make this 100% complete, just make sure that you review the insert adjacent HTML method as well that we used before in the Bankist application. I promise that we're gonna start working on the project really soon. But for now, we need another reference lecture. So here we're gonna learn about styles and attributes and classes, and you will be able to keep all of the relevant tools here in one simple lecture so that you can reference all of them in the future. And some of these tools we will use later in a project, but it's impossible to create examples for all the functions and methods that I'm going to show you now. But they are still important. So let's go. And let's actually keep working on our cookies message banner here. Okay? So we're going to start by talking about styles. And we already set CSS styles before, but there are still some more things to learn. But first, let's go back to the basics. So to set a style on an element, we get the element, dot style, and then dot the property name. And remember, this will have to use the camel case version. So background color, and then a string with the value. So here the color that I want is this one. So it's this kind of dark blue. So indeed, now this style nicely got applied to our element. And again, we didn't have to select it manually first because we already had it stored here in this message variable, which is this element that we created manually, right? We can also set the width, dot width, and remember that we have to write the CSS value exactly as we would do in CSS. And so we always have to include the unit. So in this case, I'm going to set it to a larger percentage so that it occupies this white gap here. And so now it got a little bit wider. Okay. And remember that these styles are actually set as inline styles. So styles set directly here in the DOM. So here in the style attribute of this element, we now have the background color and the width. Okay, and so these again are called inline styles. Now you might think that we are able to also read styles using this. So using the style property. But let's see what's gonna happen. So message.style, and let's say we want to get the height. So let's see what we get. And we get, well, basically nothing. And that's because using the style property like this here only works for inline styles that we set ourselves, also using the style property. So it's gonna work, for example, for the background color. So let's copy this one. And now, here you actually get the background color. And again, because it is an inline style. So a style that we set manually ourselves. But we cannot get a style that is hidden inside of a class, or maybe that doesn't even exist. So for example here, let's say we wanted to get the color. So the color is defined in the style sheet, But if we try to log it here, then it's nowhere to be found. Now, we can still get the styles if we really want to. All we need to do is to use the getComputedStyle function. So that sounds a bit weird. And this is how it works. So getComputedStyle, and VS Code already suggests it here to me. And so here we need to pass in the element. So that's message. And now you see we get this huge object here. And so this contains all of the properties with all of the values. So this is huge. And so in practice, what we then do is to simply take a certain property like color from there. And so you see, this here is the color. Or let's say we wanted to height. And so this is the computed styles. So you see computed, which means that it's the real style as it appears here on the page. And even if we do not declare it in our CSS. So for example, the height, we didn't define ourselves, but the browser, of course, needed to calculate the height to display it. And so we can then get access to that value. And so you see it's this amount of pixels. So let's now say we wanted to increase the height of this message banner here by 40 pixels. So we could get this height and then simply add 40 to that. So let's create a variable called height, or actually let's do it directly. Let's say message.style.height should be equal to getComputedStyle.height plus 40, and then don't forget the unit. So 40 pixels. But now we're going to run into a problem, because as you see, this value here itself comes in pixels. So this here is a string, okay? Or actually all of this here, which is the same as we had before up here. So the result of this is a string. So here we are trying to add a number to a string, which of course is not going to work because, well, it has this pixel here. So let me show you that nothing here happened. But remember that we already learned about a nice function which can essentially take the number out of this string. So basically parse the number from here. And that is, remember, number.parse int or parse float. In this case, it's a floating point number. So let's use parse float here actually of this value. And then we need to specify also the number 10 in this function, remember? And so now it actually works. All right. So beautiful. It took that number here and only this number part without the pixels, added 40, and then added the pixel there. So that's a bit too much. So let's leave it like this. Okay, beautiful. So this getComputedStyle can become in really handy. But now finally, let's also work with CSS custom properties, which we usually just call CSS variables. So what I mean here is these variables that we have here. So all of these. They are called custom properties, but again, they are more like variables. And the idea of CSS variables is, of course, very similar to the idea of variables in JavaScript. So this way, we can change a value in many places all over our CSS files by simply changing the value here. Now, if we can change the value here, so here in our CSS, then we can also change it right from JavaScript. So let's go back here. Or actually, let's first see where these properties are defined. So they are defined in the document root. And so in JavaScript, that is equivalent to the document. So basically the document element. All right. So document.document element, as we learned in the last video. Okay. So that is the root that we just saw in CSS. And now again, style. But now we can do set property. Okay. and then the name of our custom property. So let's say we want to change our primary color. So color, primary, and then the value that we want to set it to. Let's say orange red. But of course, any color value would work here. And so you see that everywhere in our style where we used this color, which is a nice green color, now turned orange. So here, here, and really all over the place. All right. So with this, we can easily change the style of our page simply by setting one property. All right. So with custom properties, we cannot do it like this here, but instead we need to use set property. And then we pass in the name of the property and the value. And by the way, we can do the same for all properties. So we could also use set property to set the color or the background color or the width or really whatever we want. Okay, but usually it's just easier to simply do it like this. And that's why I always do that. Okay, so that's it for styles. Let's talk a little bit about attributes now. All right, so in HTML, just to remember, all of these are attributes. So this source, alt, even the class and the ID are simply attributes of this element. And so in JavaScript, we can, of course, access and change these different attributes. So let's actually select that logo that I just showed you. And the class of that is nav underscore underscore logo. So that's 2 underscores. And so now we can access some of these, let's say, default properties. So like the alt or the source attribute. So you see, here we get the alternative text, which is this alt, and then also the source. Now this looks a bit different than the one we have here, but more about that in a second. All right, so this works because on images, they are supposed to have the alt and the source attributes on them. And so if we specify them in HTML, then JavaScript will automatically create these properties on the object. Okay, but if we add some other property that is not a standard, then JavaScript will not automatically create a property on the object. So let's add, for example, designer and set it to Jonas. Okay, and so if we now tried to read logo.designer, that's not going to work. So you see, it's undefined. And again, that is because this is not a standard property that is expected to be on images. All right. Just another one that works here, and that's a bit different than you might expect, is class name. So the class name of this element is just this class. And so you might think that it should be just class, but for historical reasons, it has to be class name like this. Okay. So this is a non-standard, and that's why it doesn't work. Okay, at least it doesn't work like this, but of course there is another way of reading this value from the DOM. It's just a little bit more difficult, but it's not a problem. So we can use getAttribute, and then here we can pass in the string designer, and that indeed it returns to us Jonas. All right. Now, just as we can read these values for these attributes, we can also set them. For example, we can say logo.the alt text should be beautiful minimalist logo. And so now let's check that out. And so indeed, that is the, well, that's actually the hero. So what I want is this. So yeah, it says beautiful minimalist logo now. All right. Oh, and by the way, there's also the opposite of get attribute, which is set attribute. So we can also say, for example, company, and then set it to bankist. And so again, if we check it out now, then there should be this new attribute created right here. All right. Now, remember that I told you that the URL here, so basically, actually the source is different than what we have in the HTML. So this URL here of this image is basically the absolute URL, while what I have here, so this one here, is just the relative URL, so relative to the folder in which the index.html file is located. So that's completely different. And if we want to get just literally this URL that we have here, then we also have to use a get attribute. Okay? So get attribute and then src. So let me actually put these together so we can see the difference. And of course, I need to log this to the console as well. Okay, and so here you see the absolute version and then here the relative. So sometimes we really need the relative one, and then make sure you use this one. So get attribute. All right, so sometimes that's very important to keep in mind, and so that's why I showed it to you here. And the same is actually true for the href attribute on links. So where is the link? I think down here I have a Twitter link. So yeah, that's this one. So let's get this class here. So very quickly, just to show you, because on links, this is also sometimes very important. Query selector. So just so you can see what I mean here. So link.href and link.get attribute and then href again. Well, in this case, they're probably the same anyway. Yeah, because both of them were already absolute anyway. So in this case, that is not a big deal. But for example, in one of these links here in the top, there it might be relevant. Okay, so let's actually try that. So let's use this one. So the button show modal, so the nav link button, which here you see is simply this hash. So let's put that here. Oh, we're missing the dot. And now indeed you see that the href property is the absolute URL once again, while using get attribute simply returns the URL as I wrote it in the HTML. Okay. Finally, there is also a special type of attributes, and that's data attributes. So data. And data attributes are a special kind of attributes that start with the word data. So let's add one here to our image here. And let's say, so data version number equals 3.0. Okay. So again, it has to start with data. All right. And then dash and then whatever we want. Okay. And what's special about this is that now this attribute is at logo.dataset and then dot version number. And here that's dataset. Don't know where that came from. Okay. And so here we use camel case, where here we have the dash. Okay. So just like property names, we need to transform this here into camel case. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay? So for these special attributes, they are always stored in the dataset object. And indeed, then down here we have that 3.0. So we use actually data attributes quite a lot when we work with the UI, especially when we need to store data in the user interface. So basically in the HTML code. And we will see how useful that can be throughout the rest of this project and of the course. Finally, to finish this here, just to make it complete, let's talk about classes. And even though at this point we actually already know all there is to know about classes. So you know that there is logo.classlist.add, and I will not do anything here. So there is add, remove, there is toggle, and there is contains. Okay, so these are the four that you really need to know. And here apparently we need to pass in something. Maybe the empty string works, but I'm not sure. Well, apparently it doesn't. Let's just write some name here. Just C for class. Okay. And keep in mind that you can also add multiple classes by passing in multiple values. And of course, here I'm just writing completely fake class names just to make a point. Okay, now just as we could read the class name here using the class name property, we could also use that to set a class. So we could do logo.className and then set that, well, let's say to Jonas. Okay, however, don't use this. Don't use, okay, because this will override all the existing classes, and also it allows us to only put one class on any element. All right, so again, only one class, and it will override whatever is already there, while these four methods here make it really nice to work with the classes by simply allowing us to add and remove classes based on their names without interfering with the classes that are already there. Just keep in mind that this one here is really called contains and not includes like it is called in arrays. So I hope that this serves as a nice reference for all these different ways of working with classes, attributes, and styles in JavaScript. But now in the next lecture, let's finally start to work on our project here. Let's now start working on the Bankist website. And we're going to start by implementing smooth scrolling. And the functionality that we're going to implement now is when we click on this button, then it will smoothly scroll to this first section. Okay, so that's it. Simple effect. All that happens is one click, and the effect is that it smoothly scrolls here to this first section. So we're going to see two ways of doing this. First, one a bit more old school, which will allow me to show you a couple of interesting stuff. And then finally, I will show you the more modern way, which only works in super modern browsers. So let's start by selecting the button and the section that we want to scroll to. So that button is, it's this one, button scroll to. All right. And then the section is this one, section 1. So with this ID of section 1. So const button scroll to is document.query selector. All right. And now section 1 is document.query selector. And now it's the ID, so that's the hash, and then section --1. So that's the easy part. And now, as always, we need to start by adding an event listener to the button. .add event listener on click, and then our function. And let's actually give it the event. So in the first way that we're going to do, we need to first get the coordinates of the element that we want to scroll to. So let me show you how. So S1 coords, and that's section 1 dot get bounding client rect. All right, that sounds like a mouthful. It's actually pretty straightforward. Let me show it to you actually first. So when I click this, then we get this DOM rectangle. All right, and it has all of these properties. So the X position, which is measured from the left side, the Y position, which is measured from the top, and then the width of the element, the height, and then a lot of other properties. All right, and this element is probably not the best one to understand this. So let's get this rectangle for the button. So that's the element we just clicked. So e.target, remember, so e.target is essentially this element here, so the one that was clicked. And now get bounding client rectangle as well. And so let's take a look at that second one. So this 30 pixels here is the distance between the border here of the browser. All right, and then this Y is this distance from the top. Then we also have the width, which is this 112, the height, and yeah, here we also get the top, which is in this case similar to Y, okay, but it isn't always, because when we scroll, then X and Y actually change. Let me show that to you. And if I click this again now, then let's take a look here. So you see that Y is now only 168 pixels. And so that's the distance between this element and the top of this viewport. So this bounding client rect is basically relative to this visible viewport. All right. And in fact, we can also get the current scroll position. So since we're talking about scrolling, let me show that to you as well. So current scroll, so that's the X and the Y positions, just so we see what we are looking at. So these values are at window, page X offset, and page Y offset. So let me just scroll somewhere here, click this, and so we get that the current scroll is at 0 from X, so there's no horizontal scroll, and vertically we already scrolled 290 pixels here at this point. So when we're at the very top, then these two values should both be 0, and so yeah, now they are. So basically this Y coordinate here is the distance between the current position here of the viewport and the top of the page. So here at this line, for example, when we're here, if we get to scroll now, well, now we can't because we can't click on the button, but yeah, you get the point. So the distance, for example, here is now 421. So that means that from this very edge of the browser right now, all the way to the top of the page, it is 421 pixels, okay? And sometimes that's very important to know in certain applications. And if you're even more curious, then since we're talking about coordinates and stuff, we can also read the height and the width of this viewport. So again, of this rectangle in which we can see the current portion of the page. So height and width of viewport, and they are at document.documentElement dot client height, and then the same with client width. Client width. All right. So you see that this height here is 588 and the width 1067. So if I change this here, so this is kind of half now, So let's see what value we get now. And so now it is 276. Okay, and so that's because I decreased that visible box there. And so the height of the viewport is of course different. So let's reload here, click again. And so, yeah, here we get all kinds of interesting information about coordinates, scrolling, and dimensions of the viewport. All right. But anyway, the goal of actually getting these coordinates is because we need them to scroll to this first section here. All right. So basically we need these coordinates here to tell JavaScript where it should scroll to. So let's now do that actually. So scrolling, and we use window.scrollTo. Okay. So that's a global function that's available on the window object. And here the first argument is the left position. And so that is at S1 chords. And let's take a look here. So this is the one. Oh, now it's gone. So we are interested here in this left value right now. So it is 0. And that's good because we don't want any horizontal scroll. Then for the second one, we're going to be interested in the top, which is, again, the position from the top of the viewport. So the section starts here. So it's basically these 270 pixels right there. Okay. So left and S1 chords dot top. So let's give it some more space and let's try it. And indeed, now it worked. So we are now here at the top of section 1. Okay. And so that's because the top was at 730 pixels. And so that's the distance that was scrolled. However, watch what happens when I click again. So now it doesn't really work, does it? Well, that's because this top here that we specified is always relative to the viewport, but not to the document. So not to the top of the page, basically. Right? So let me show it to you again. So it works when we are here. All right? And that's because this Y position here, which is the same as this top, is 429, which is basically the distance between this point and this point. Okay? But if we're doing it here, then the distance between the line and the top of the viewport here is a lot less. So it's only like 200 or something. So let's see. It is only, actually it's only 112. Well, that doesn't make sense. Well, actually, it's this one. So it's only 333. All right. And so basically it only scrolled to position 333. While in fact, we wanted to scroll all the way to here, which was at something like, so it was at 492, or actually at 713. Okay, so I know it's all a little bit confusing, and in order to really understand all of these numbers, you have to play around with this a lot by yourself. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to make sense of this. But the solution to this problem is to simply add the current scroll position to the top value here. And with this, we will then determine the position of this section here, not relative to the viewport, so to the top of this browser window here, but instead to the top of the page. Okay? So again, the position of this section here is always this top, which is from here to the viewport, plus the current scroll position. And so that's the distance from here all the way to the top. Okay, so let's add that here. And again, to really make sense of all I'm saying here, please play around with this a lot by yourself. Okay, so page Y offset And here it should actually also be window. And then we also, just for the sake of completeness, add it here as well. So window.page x offset. Okay, so let's see if it still works here. And it does. And now let's try it from somewhere else, like here. And now it works. Now it goes to the correct place. And so by doing this here, we basically determined the absolute position of this element relative to the document, so to the entire page. And that's important to note. So if you need that, then this is how you calculate it. So again, the current position plus the current scroll. All right. Now we can even make this better. So .scrollTo again, because there is a way of making this animation nice and smooth. And this works by passing in an object now instead of just one argument. So let's get these two, and then let's comment all of this out. And so the properties that we need to specify are the left. So this is the left. This is the top. And so this is actually called top. And then we also have a property called behavior. And so here we can now specify smooth. All right. So to implement smooth scrolling like this, we need to specify an object with the left, top, and behavior properties. So let's try it out. And it works. Great. So that is a lot better, isn't it? And again, it also is going to work from this position. And the browser automatically figures out the speed it should go to make this look really nice. All right. So this is kind of the old school way still of doing it. So manually calculating all of these values here and then saying that we want to scroll to this position. All right. But there is a more modern way. And it works like this. We simply take the element that we want to scroll to, and that is section 1. And on that, we call scrollIntoView. And then we pass in an object and specify, again, behavior, and set it to smooth. And that's actually it. Then we don't need any of this. Okay, let me prove it to you. And it works just the same. So without any of these weird calculations here with these weird positions and all of that, it's all unnecessary if we are able to use this function here. And again, this only works in modern browsers, but if you only need to support these, then you are 100% fine using only this method. But I think it was still a good idea to show you all of these different numbers here. So like calculating the current scroll positions or the current window positions and sizes, and also all the sizes of the elements that we can get using this function. And by the way, these client height and width here are not counting with the scroll bars. It's just the dimensions of the viewport that are actually available for the content. And of course, that excludes any scroll bars. In this lecture and the next ones, we're going to talk a little bit more about events. Now, we already worked with events before, of course, but now let's add some more important concepts and also make things a bit more clear. So, an event is basically a signal that is generated by a certain DOM node. And a signal means that something has happened. For example, a click somewhere, or the mouse moving, or the user triggering the full screen mode, and really anything of importance that happens on our web page generates an event. And as we already know, we can then listen for these events in our code using event listeners, so that we can then handle them if we'd like. But no matter if we handle a certain event or not, for example a click, that event will always happen when a user clicks. So it doesn't matter if we're actually listening for it or not. All right? And that's going to be important to understand also in the next video. Now, we already worked with a couple of different events earlier in the course, but now let's take a look at another type of events, which is the mouse enter event. But let's start by selecting an element, and let's use the h1 element this time. So we have an h1, which is this here, and so let's just say document.querySelector h1, and now we can listen for that event. So we already know about this one, so add event listener, but in this video we're going to take a look at two more ways of listening for events. All right, but anyway, let's now use mouse enter as I said previously. So mouse enter, and then as always a function with an event. So the mouse enter event here is a little bit like the hover event in CSS. So it fires whenever a mouse enters a certain element. So just as the name says. So whenever that happens, let's create an alert which says add event listener, just so we know where this one is coming from. Great. You are reading the heading. Okay. And let's try it out now. And indeed, as we hovered over it, we got this alert. And if we do it again, it comes again. So that works just fine. Let's now actually take a look at a list of different events on MDN. Let's say JavaScript events. And yeah, this is what I was looking for. So this event reference. So let's take a look at some of the more important ones. So we see that we already used the click events. So where are they? So here, mouse events. So click, this is the one we have been using all the time. But this time we used mouse enter. And as you see, there's then also mouse leave, which is fired off when the mouse is moved off the element. And then you have all of these. And of course, you can take a look at this list here by yourself. And you see that there is all these different kinds of events that we can eventually learn how to respond to. But usually the most important ones are the ones related to mouse and the keyboard ones. Okay? But for example, there are also some for the clipboard and for full screen and for resizing the page and for when we scroll the page and so on and so forth. Okay? So here is the warning again. But anyway, let me now show you another way of attaching an event listener to an element. And that is by using the so-called onEvent property directly on the element. So for example, when we want to listen for mouse enter, there is a property called on mouse enter. And then we can simply set that property to this function. All right. So here, let's do that. Just to see. And so now we get, of course, the alert from before, but we should get a second alert as well. And indeed, here it is. Okay. And so actually for each of the events that we just saw in the table, there is one onEvent property like this one. For example, also on click. All right. However, this way of listening to events is a bit old school. So it used to be done like this in the old days, but now we usually always use add event listener. Okay, so I'm just showing you this in case you ever come across this way of listening for events. Now there are two ways why add event listener is better, and the first one is that it allows us to add multiple event listeners to the same event. So we could do this here again and simply change the function here. But if we did the same with this property, then the second function would basically simply override the first one. All right, so that's one advantage of addEventListener. And the second one, even more important, is that we can actually remove an event handler in case we don't need it anymore. And this is something that we hadn't done before, but it's actually very simple and very useful from time to time. And to do that, first we need to export the function into a named function. So we cannot just write, for example, the same function and expect it to work. That's not going to work. So let's take this here out. And let's say alert h1 is this function. And then on h1, here I want to pass in that. Let's just comment out this one so it doesn't get in our way. And so let's see. And indeed, it still works. That was not on purpose, but we can now actually prevent that from happening. So after we listened for an event and then handled that event here in this function, we can then remove that event listener. So here we can say h1 and now remove event listener. And again, we have to say mouse enter and then the name of the function. And so this is why we had to export the function into its own function. All right. And so let's see. So indeed, we got this alert now. But if I now hover this again, then nothing happens. And that's because in the same event handler function, we also then removed the event listener. And so this makes it that we can only listen for the event once. So this is a nice pattern whenever you only want to listen to any event just once. But of course, this doesn't have to be in here. So you can remove the event listener at any place in our code. For example, we could remove it after a certain time has passed. So let's use setTimeout here and a simple arrow function. And let's say that after 3 seconds have passed, we want to remove the event listener. So now we get it. And right now, apparently 3 seconds have already passed. And so now it's gone. All right. So this is another pattern of removing the event listener. But of course, there are going to be other situations where this is helpful. Finally, there's also a third way of handling events, which is by using an HTML attribute. Now, this one should actually not be used, but just for the sake of curiosity, I'm going to show it to you here. So let's actually this time use the onClick, just so we have a different one. But so this is quite similar to what we did here before in the JavaScript with the on mouse enter. We're simply defining it directly in HTML. Then here, we basically specify a string, and then we say what we want to happen. So this is pretty weird, but well, this is kind of old school JavaScript from the early days. Alert. Okay, and so now when we click here, then we get HTML alert. All right. But anyway, we don't need to bother with this one, but I'm just going to leave it here for you as a reference. And so that's different ways of handling events and also how to remove event listeners in case we don't need them anymore. Next up, you will learn about the most important property of events, which is bubbling. So let's move on right to the next video. JavaScript events have a very important property. They have a so-called capturing phase and a bubbling phase. So what does that mean? Well, let's find out. So here we have a very simple HTML document along with a DOM tree, but only for the anchor element that's represented in red here. So here we can see exactly all the parent elements of that red anchor element. And that's because we're going to simulate what exactly happens with an event when someone clicks on that link. So maybe pause the video for a minute and analyze this structure here. But anyway, let's now say that a click happens on the link. And as we already know, the DOM then generates a click event right away. However, this event is actually not generated at the target element, so at the element where the event happened, in this case the click on the anchor element. Instead, the event is actually generated at the root of the document, so at the very top of the DOM tree. And from there, the so-called capturing phase happens, where the event then travels all the way down from the document root to the target element. And as the event travels down the tree, it will pass through every single parent element of the target element. So in our example here, the HTML element, the body element, the section, then the paragraph, until it finally reaches its target. As soon as the event reaches the target phase begins, where events can be handled right at the target. And as we already know, we do that with event listeners such as this one. So event listeners wait for a certain event to happen on a certain element, and as soon as the event occurs, it runs the attached callback function. In this example, it will simply create this alert window. All right? And again, this happens in the target phase. All right. Now, after reaching the target, the event then actually travels all the way up to the document root again, in the so-called bubbling phase. So we say that events bubble up from the target to the document root. And just like in the capturing phase, the event passes through all its parent elements. And really just the parents, so not through any sibling elements. So as an event travels down and up the tree, they pass through all the parent elements, but not through any sibling element. But now you might be wondering, why is this so important? Why are we learning about all this detail? Well, it is indeed very important because basically it's as if the event also happened in each of the parent elements. So again, as the event bubbles through a parent element, it's as if the event had happened right in that very element. What this means is that if we attach the same event listener also, for example, to the section element, then we would get the exact same alert window for the section element as well. So we would have handled the exact same event twice, once at its target and once at one of its parent elements. And this behavior will allow us to implement really powerful patterns, as we will see throughout the rest of this section. So this really is very, very important to understand. Now, by default, events can only be handled in the target and in the bubbling phase. However, we can set up event listeners in a way that they listen to events in the capturing phase instead. Also, actually, not all types of events do have a capturing and bubbling phase. Some of them are created right on the target element, and so we can only handle them there. But really, most of the events do capture and bubble, such as I described it here in this lecture. We can also say that events propagate, which is really what capturing and bubbling is. It's events propagating from one place to another. All right, so I hope that all of this made sense. And so let's now actually see this in action in the next video. So let's now see event propagation in practice, and mainly event bubbling. And we're going to do that by attaching event handlers to this navigation link here, and also all of its parent elements. Then as we click this link, we will give all these elements random background colors, and this will then allow us to visualize exactly how event bubbling is happening. And it will make sense once you see it actually working. And let's actually start by creating that random color that I just mentioned. And the random color is basically just a string like RGB, and then with a value between 0 and 255. So here with commas, actually. And so you see that VS Code is already showing this as a color. So let's start with the random number generator. And this one I will simply write now because we already did it in the previous section. So that's going to be math.floor. So maybe I could have just copied this code here, but then it would appear that this code simply magically appears, and I don't really like that when I'm watching a tutorial myself. Okay, so this was the formula that we used before to generate a random integer, and now we can use that to create a random color. So random color, and let's use another arrow function here. And so now we simply need to follow this formula here. So here we need random int, and as I said, with a value between 0 and 255. So this, and then 3 times. Okay, and that's it. Let's just check it out. 255. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So you see that random colors keep appearing down there now. Okay, but now let's actually attach the event handlers that I was mentioning. So I want to attach an event handler to this link and then to the parent elements as well. So let's check our HTML. And so the link itself is the nav link. And then let's attach an event handler also to nav links. So that's going to be this entire header there. Let me actually show it to you here. So I'm going to use this link here. So you see it's appearing in blue up there. So this link, then this whole element, and then also this entire header here. So that's with the class of nav. So document.query selector. And here we are actually going to need the event. And then as always, just to see if it works. And it does. So let's now grab some of these others. So there's links and nav. Remember, so that's the 3 that we want to use here. And so any one that we click now, we will see link. So for now, that doesn't really matter, because what I want to show you now is what happens when we assign a random background color to first starting with this one. So we can say this, and remember that in an event handler, the this keyword points always to the element on which that event handler is attached. So in this case, that's going to be this link. All right. So we say this.style dot background color and set it equal to a random color. And for now, let's just get rid of these here just to see if this works. Oh, and now we see this is jumping around, and that's because of this hash there. So let me get rid of this for now. And this here as well. And now as we click, it reloads the page. So what we need here is this, I guess. And so yeah, now it works. And so as we click here, we see that the color of this element keeps changing. But now, what if we perform the exact same action on the parent element? So let's copy this and put it here. And again, keep in mind that this navlinks element is the parent of this link. So it's all of this block here. So when I click this link now here, what do you think is going to happen to the navlinks element? So to that whole container? Well, let's see. And you see that the container also got its own random background color. So based on what we learned in the last video, why do you think this is happening? Well, just as we learned before, the event actually happens at the document root, and from there it then travels down to the target element. And so in this case, that is this link. And then from there it bubbles up. And bubbling up means that basically it's as if the event had also happened in all of the parent elements. And so that is the reason why this exact event is now also being handled by this event listener here that is on navlinks. Okay? So again, it is as if the click event here on this link had also happened right here in this element. So in the navlinks element. All right? So both of these handlers here are now handling the same event which happened here on this link. And as we keep clicking, of course, the same keeps happening. Now, what do you think happens when we click only outside here? So only in the navlinks? Well, let's see. So you see that the color on the link itself keeps unchanged. And that's because this is the parent element. And so from here, the event only bubbles up to its parent elements. So let's see what happens when we actually also paste this here into this whole nav bar. So let's see. And indeed, now the click event that happened here was indeed handled in all three places. So in all three elements which have a click event handler. Great. But let's now dig a little bit deeper and talk about the event target. So here let me log to the console. First saying that this is the link, and then event.target. And the target is essentially where the event originated. So where the event first happened. So this is not the element on which the handler is actually attached. Okay? So again, this is where the event happened. So in this case, where the click happened. And it is not the element on which the event handler was attached. So let me put the same here also. And let's call this one here the container and the nav. Okay. And now watch what happens again when I click on this link. Okay. So one more time, all the three elements got a random background color. And you see that the target, which is this one here, is always the same. Okay. So in all three handlers, the target element will always be the same. And that's, of course, the element where the click first happened. And it appears in all the three handlers because all of them are essentially handling the exact same event. So this E here, so this event that each of them receives, is indeed the exact same event. And again, that is because of event bubbling. So the event originates here in this link, but then it bubbles up to its parent element, which is this one, and from there to its next parent element. And from there, it will travel even further up in the DOM tree. And so we can then handle that event in all of the parent elements. And that is exactly what we did here. All right. Now, besides the target, there's actually also the current target. So let me log that here as well. And the current target is indeed the element on which the event handler is attached. So e.currentTarget, and here e.currentTarget. So if we do this now, then you will see that the current target is not the same. Well, in the link it is, of course, because that's where the event happened, and it's also where the handler is attached to. But then here, it is, of course, the nav links, so the container, and here the whole navigation element. All right, and so you might have noticed that the current target is exactly the same as the this keyword, right? So the this keyword is also the one pointing to the element on which the event listener is attached to, so such as we used here. And all of this is important to know when you really want to gain a deep understanding of the DOM and how it works. So here you see we got indeed true. So the this keyword and event.currentTarget are going to be exactly the same in any event handler. Another thing that I wanted to show you is that we can actually stop the event propagation. So let me show that to you. Propagation. And so all we have to do is to simply call on the event stop propagation. And that's it. So when we try to do the same thing now, watch what happens. So now the two parent elements did not change their background colors, which means that the event never arrived at those elements, right? That's why they weren't handled there. And again, that is because we stopped the propagation right here, okay? And so the propagation phase then never happened for this event. And therefore, these events never reached this element and also not this element. All right? Now, in practice, that's usually not a good idea to stop propagation, but I still showed it to you here in case you really need it sometime. So stopping the event propagation like this can sometimes fix problems in very complex applications with many handlers for the same events. But in general, it's not really a good idea to stop the propagation of events. So as we just saw, these three event handlers that we set up here receive events from the target elements and also from the bubbling phase, right? So in other words, the event handler functions are listening for click events that happen on the element itself, like this, right? Or like this, and where now, of course, only the background color of this one changes. And they're also listening for events that keep bubbling up from their child elements. And that's the reason why the color changes in all of the parent elements here as well. So the two phases that I just described are phase 2 and phase 3 in the slide that we saw in the last video, right? But now, what about the capture phase? So that was phase 1. Well, as we learned, events are captured when they come down from the document root all the way to the target. But our event handlers are not picking up these events during the capture phase. Remember that? So I mentioned that addEventListener here is only listening for events in the bubbling phase, but not in the capturing phase. So that is the default behavior of the addEventListener method. And the reason for that is that the capturing phase is usually irrelevant for us. It's just not that useful. Now, on the other hand, the bubbling phase can be very useful for something called event delegation. So that's something that we're going to do in the next lecture. However, if we really do want to catch events during the capturing phase, we can define a third parameter in the addEventListener function. So, for example, here, we can set the third parameter to true or false. And so let's set it to true. And so in this case, where this useCapture parameter is set to true, the event handler will no longer listen to bubbling events, but instead to capturing events. Now in practice, that's going to look the same here. Okay, but as we take a look here in our log, you will see that now the nav is actually the first appearing. And let's clear that here and see it again. So you see that now the first element through which the event passes is the navigation. And the reason for that is that this element is now actually listening for the event as it travels down from the DOM, while these other ones are listening for the event as it travels back up. And so that happens later, and therefore the nav is now the first one to show up, because this of course is the first one to happen, because first the event travels down all the way to the target, and only then it bubbles back up. And so these other two event handlers here, they are looking for bubbling events, and so therefore they are going to happen after this first one. Now they're still all working with the same event, they're simply doing it in different phases of the event propagation. And if that sounds confusing, then please take another look at the slide that I showed you in the last video. You can imagine that slide maybe with these elements that we're working with here, and then picture the event traveling down and up again, and how we capture it here in the capturing phase. So with this flag here set to true. So I hope that made sense, but let's now actually get rid of this. So by default, this is set to false, and so getting rid of this is the same as setting this argument to false. So as I said, capturing is actually rarely used these days. And the only reason why both capturing and bubbling actually exist is only for historical reasons. So from the time where different browsers implemented different versions of JavaScript. But anyway, what really matters that you really understand here is that why these three boxes here get three different background colors, even though the click only happened on this element. And I think I made that really clear in this video and also in the last one. Let's now use the power of event bubbling to implement something called event delegation. So what we're going to do is to implement a smooth scrolling behavior in the navigation, so that when we click one of these links here, it will then automatically scroll smoothly to the corresponding section. All right. So right now, as we click one of these links, it actually moves there, but of course we want this to happen smoothly. And so let's now go ahead and use event delegation to implement this navigation. And actually, let's do that here at the top of the file. So here in the beginning, I will have all the code that is actually really related to the page, while down here we then have the code that we have been using to experiment with some stuff. All right. So page navigation comes right here after the model window. Let's grab this separator code here. And in fact, we can also put this code here, which was for scrolling. So this code, we also need it active in order to make this button here work, right? So let's put that actually here second. And okay. This here. All right. And these selections, I will put all of them here at the top. All right. So that's a little bit of a nicer organization, having, just like in the last project, all of the selection in one nice line. All right. Now we get this error here that button scrollTo has already been declared. Oh, and that's because we actually wanted to cut this code. So we no longer want it here. Okay, so with this, we cleaned it up a little bit. And so let's now go actually to the place in code where we want to implement the page navigation. Now let's actually first implement this without using event delegation so that you can see the problem in the approach that we've been using so far. And so let's now select all of these 3 links here. So document.query selector, and actually it's got to be query selector all. And then, as we already saw in the previous video, they are called nav __ a link. Okay, so this will return a node list, and now we can use the for each method in order to attach an event handler to each of the elements that are in the node list. So actually just as we did up here, right? Okay, so for each, and so our callback function here, which gets access to the current element in the node list. And so to each element, let's now use the add event listener method. So a click, and then another callback function. So now we have callback inside of callback, but that's not a problem at all. All right, so here we again want access to the event. And now let's just start by logging to console link just like this. So indeed we get link here and on this one and also on this one. So 3 times link. Now you already start to see the problem, which is that by default, clicking one of these links will scroll to the position in the HTML. And that's because of these so-called anchors. Let me show it to you in the HTML. And so these here are called anchors. So hash and then some name here will automatically move the page to the element which has the ID of this. So let's see, down here we have, here we have this section with the ID section 2. And so as we click here, then it will automatically move to exactly that section. And we can see it here also in the URL bar, right? So we basically need to prevent that from happening. Let me just put this back here because in the last lecture, we deleted this section 1 that was here. And so as I was saying, we need to prevent these default behavior. And so for that, we use once more event, or E in this case, dot prevent default. And so let's see now. And indeed, now nothing happens. So we no longer scroll to the page. And you see that the URL bar is actually also no longer changing as we click here. So that problem is fixed. And so now let's implement the smooth navigation, or the smooth scrolling actually. Because if we didn't want the scrolling to be smooth, then we actually wouldn't need any of this, because we already saw that the browser will actually automatically move to that place, so to that anchor that we defined in HTML. Now, that anchor, however, so basically this part here is still going to be very useful, because we can now take this href attribute. So basically we can take this value here and select the element that we want to scroll to based on this. Because if we think about this, this actually looks pretty much like a selector for an ID, right? So let me write the code here, and then I will explain a little bit more. So let's get that href actually, and I'm going to call it ID. So that is at this, which is the current element, remember, dot get attribute, and then the href. Okay, and I used the get attribute function here because, as we learned before, I actually only want that part that we literally write here. So I don't want the absolute URL, and so that's why I cannot write simply this dot href. Remember that? Anyway, let's now log this to the console to see again what we're doing here. And so you see we get now section 1 here, 2, and 3. And now, as I was saying before, this here looks pretty much like a selector already. And so we can now take this and select an element based